Patrick Ishmael is my guest right now from the Show Me Institute. Patrick, how are you? Happy Friday.
Happy Friday. How are you, Mark?
I am doing great, thank you. We've got all kinds of news going on today, not the least of which was, and I hate the term, but yesterday, of course, the United States Senate, they say, went nuclear. I'm not quite sure why they use that term because the Democrats nuked part of these rules a long time ago. But the issue is whether or not filibusters should be a thing, right?
Well, right. And I think that filibusters ought to be a thing, particularly when you're talking about, legislative changes. But at some point, particularly when you're talking about Supreme Court nominations, historically, Supreme Court nominations, judicial nominations in general, were not subject to the sorts of filibusters or these cloture motions that we're really kind of seeing today. It's more of a, last 20 years kind of development in this tradition. And I think it's a real problem. I think it goes back to, the hyper politicization of our culture in general, but also of our politics, even when it comes to the courts. What we want to see in our courts is a court that is neutral, that is going to weigh all the facts and try to come to a conclusion that isn't, partisan. But in the case of the actual nomination of a lot of judges these days, it really does come down to partisan affiliation. And you saw the vote today on Gorsuch. It was, by and large, a partisan vote. I think there were 3 Democrats that crossed over and voted with Republicans to approve him. But if you look historically over the last 100 years, most of those votes are, something close to 100-0 or something like that. And It's only a recent development that they really became very partisan and very difficult when it really does, I think, detract from our court system over the long haul.
So how does this relate to Missouri? Because I know they recently looked at changing the rules in Missouri, correct? Modifying them?
Yeah, they've been faced with a similar kind of filibuster problem in the state legislature. And it's of the sort that, it doesn't really matter what the legislation is necessarily. It oftentimes comes to a screeching halt because they know that something else having to do with maybe education reform is upcoming or labor reform is upcoming. And when those bills come up, those get filibustered as well. And the result has been over the course of the last 3 or so months that not a whole lot of legislation has been coming out of the state Senate.
Yeah.
And the state Senate has a supermajority of, I think, conservatives on it. And yet you really aren't seeing a whole lot of progress on that front. It's not so much even about, straight up filibuster. It's basically everyone saying, we're not going to call the previous question, which would actually bring this legislation to a vote. There's a lot of deference, a lot of concern about tradition, but the tradition of the Senate isn't to do nothing; it's actually to deliberate. And a lot of these discussions aren't so much about deliberation; it's about obstruction right now.
Yeah, that's sure what it seems like. And somebody had told me that down in the Missouri Senate right now, there had sort of been an agreement struck that several pieces of major legislation, the Democrats were going to let it go as long as some other things weren't pushed. And I don't know who that agreement was between, but certainly this rule that you're talking about here about whether the main question should be now put is one of those things that would allow them to skirt that, correct?
Correct. So, and a lot of times when you've seen it in past years, they call it calling the previous question, and it brings the legislation basically up to a vote after it's been passed. The problem after the PQ, though, is that the whatever party wants to slow down the process after that, they can really make it difficult to pass anything after that.
Right.
And so the Senate is very hesitant to try to pursue a PQ. And so what you really have to take a look at is, should there be a rule limiting debate on legislation where it will come to a vote automatically? And I think it's within the power of the Senate to change its own rules to make it a little bit more fluid and a little bit more focused on actually debating the substantive legislation that's before them. Because right now, the advantage is to folks who are willing to say, I'm just going to stand here and talk for 5 hours, and I'm going to make sure that nothing else comes up, important legislation as well, because I don't want this legislation to pass. Like I said, there's a place for a filibuster, and you have to make sure that you are facilitating it where it's appropriate. But when you're talking about, in Missouri, we have super majorities in the House and the Senate. We have a conservative governor. I think there's a pretty clear mandate to make progress, and I hate to look at the lack of progress so far and say, what's the reason for why this is all really slowing down? Because there are ways to get around it. The question is, why isn't anything really happening?
Yeah, that's a good point. And you wrote a piece in Forbes magazine on this, correct?
Correct.
Yep.
It talks about the problems that have been in the state Senate for the last 3 or 4 months, and we only have about 6 weeks left.
Well, I'll tell you what, Patrick Ishmael, thank you so much for your time. I'll direct people to the website, showmeinstitute.org, and they can read more on that issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark.
Have a great Friday. Appreciate that. Good to get him on here. So go to showmeinstitute.org, and you can read more on that stuff and the rules changes, because as he mentioned, it's not just happening up on Capitol Hill. Hey, you know what?